just first your reaction to what Jeremy Hunt was saying there in that address today. It was pretty comprehensive, not very much talk of tax cuts, some talk about trying to grow the economy. I mean, how optimistic do you think people ought to be after listening to that speech?
Well, I think what Jeremy Hunt was setting out was a clear message that we've still got more work to do on stabilising the public finances. If we go back just to last September, October, we were teetering on the brink of some pretty severe consequences for a government then advocating a very dangerous approach with public finances. What Jeremy's said today is that we won't take chances with the public finances because having a stable currency, having stable public finances is the basic building block for the economic growth that we all want to see. But he also was very clear that once we've got past that stage and economic growth is being delivered, he understands the case for reducing taxes in order to increase incentives for people to work, incentives for entrepreneurs to take risks, incentives for investors to come and invest their capital in the UK.
Well, that's a really interesting point that you make there, because there is a bit of a decision to make, isn't there, for the Chancellor when he can come to the point at which he feels comfortable to cut taxes. Do you think, in your opinion, he should look first at cutting business taxes, or should it be our personal taxes first?
Well, I've never been of the view that a 25% corporation tax rate is going to be fundamentally damaging to the UK. Of course, business would prefer to have slightly lower corporation tax rates, but 25% is not excessively high by international standards. So I think businesses will be reassured to hear that in the long run, there is a hope to be able to lower business taxes, but I don't think it's something that's critical for the moment. What business will want to see is that the public finances are under control, that inflation has been tamed, and that consumer demand in the UK is bouncing back. Prosperous households provide strong and buoyant demand for businesses to sell their products. And that's what businesses will be looking for first and foremost.
Well, that's interesting. So you're saying that cutting personal taxes would actually help the Chancellor to reach those goals that he's talked about today. So that's really what his priority ought to be.
Well, I think his first priority is stabilising the public finances. Second priority is stimulating economic growth. And that's lots of what economists call supply side interventions to make the economy work better, looking at regulation, looking at education and skills, looking at infrastructure, looking at the north-south balance, all those things that will stimulate output from the economy, more goods and services being produced so that we are all better off. And then as the economy recovers, we can look at and starts to grow faster. That will create the capacity for reducing taxes or increasing public spending. And there will be, that's a genuine political difference between political parties that want to see taxes a little bit lower and political parties that would rather see taxes rising and increasing public spending.
Yeah, which lots of Conservative MPs are hoping that the Chancellor will be able to talk about cutting personal taxes, of course, before the next election.
Exactly.
But something else that came up in that speech today, which I thought was fascinating, and we heard from somebody who was in this situation on the programme earlier on today, Florence. Jeremy Hunt making clear he wants people to get back into work. I mean, lots of people economically inactive. Do you think that's doable, or should the government really be looking to immigration and potentially increasing some of the flow of people into the country to try and solve that problem?
Well, I think it's got to do both. Of course, in the medium term, it's always preferable to get people who are outside the workforce, who are already here in the UK, already housed, already their kids are being educated, their healthcare needs are being taken care of. Of course, it's better to get them back into the productive economy, helping to expand the total volume of goods and services that we produce in the country. But that is going to take time. I mean, we don't have large numbers of people who are simply unemployed, as it were, sitting on the bench waiting to be called onto the field. The people that Jeremy is talking about, quite rightly, are people often suffering from long-term health conditions or perhaps mental health conditions who can be brought back into the workforce, but for whom that journey back into the workforce will be a lot more complicated than for people who are simply unemployed and wanting and able to work now.
Mm.
And the needs of the economy are immediate. So we are going to have to open our economy to more overseas workers. And for my money, this would be about short-term workers, people coming here short-term to work and then go home. We're not talking about people coming here to permanently migrate to the UK. But I think there is a need to open the UK up to short-term immigration for work now. But over the medium term, we should certainly look to bring those people who are outside the workforce but could be brought back into it gradually back into play.
On those short-term workers, are you talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of visas potentially for people to come here to work?
I think there's a need for hundreds of thousands now to get the economy moving again. Look, there are literally businesses today which are not able to operate at full capacity because they can't get people to wait tables, they can't get people to work in kitchens, they can't get people to drive delivery vans, and can't get people to clean hotel rooms, and so on and so forth. If we are able to bring in people short term to fill those positions, our GDP, our national output, will grow immediately. And that's what we need to see right now. As inflation starts to come down this year and the economy is ready to move forward, we cannot have it held back by a lack of lower skilled labor. I think, frankly, we're doing okay on higher skills, but on low skills, we've still got a problem. Now, many of those people who are outside the economy at the moment, who can perhaps be brought back into the economy, many of them will be looking for entry-level jobs rather than high-skilled jobs. Perhaps quite a lot of them will be looking for part-time work. So over time, we can look to that cohort of people to fill some of those jobs. But in the short term, the immediate need, if you talk to publicans, talk to restaurateurs, talk to hotel operators, talk to delivery companies, they don't need people in 6 months or 2 years' time. They need people right now.
A quick yes or no, if you were still in the Treasury right now, would you grant nurses a 10% pay rise?
No. The country cannot afford to allow pay inflation to get out of control. If it does, it will feed back through into further price inflation and we'll all be worse off, including nurses and public sector workers who are seeking those pay increases.
And finally, on Nadeem Zahawi, I mean, clearly there are concerns about what has happened here regarding HMRC, his tax affairs and the fine. If it does emerge that he settled a fine with HMRC while he was Chancellor, do you see that as a problem?
Well, it would be a problem for me personally. I would not have felt able and would not feel able now, not that anyone's likely to offer it to me, to accept the office of Chancellor if I was currently engaged in a tax dispute with HMRC. That just isn't right. And, it's not about this rule or that rule or some written code. It's just about common sense and what feels right. And that doesn't feel right to me. But I've said before, and I'll say again, ultimately, appointments are at the discretion of the Prime Minister. And if, as we have been told, Mr. Zahawi did make all of this information about his situation with HMRC clear to the Cabinet Office, and the Prime Minister of the day, Boris Johnson, went ahead and appointed him anyway, then this question has to lie at his doorstep. He has to answer the question why he considered that appointment appropriate.
And should Nadeem Zahawi stand aside now, do you believe?
Well, the Prime Minister's made clear that he's instigated a process and he wants that process to finish and then he will act upon it. As I've said, I would not have accepted an appointment to the post of Chancellor if I was in a current live negotiation with HMRC. And I think that's all I can say on the matter.
What did you make of Jeremy Hunt's speech this morning?
Well, it wasn't intended to be a policy speech. It had very little actual policy decision in it. It was setting an approach to his job, and the policy changes, the first ones will come, the significant ones, I assume, in the budget in a couple of months' time, as has just been said. I agree with most of it. I certainly think one should take an optimistic approach to these things. It will take quite a long time, however, to get back to having a healthy economy again, because we never really picked up after the 2008 recession. And in addition to COVID, and in addition to the Ukraine war and the supply chain disruptions and the problems in China, which of course a global inflationary recession, with many countries having similar problems to ourselves, we of course have Brexit, which has did great damage to our economy, particular damage to our trade. Is just almost the last straw, which is why we still haven't got our economy back to where it was before the pandemic.
Which of those two things that you've just highlighted there, I mean, the impact of inflation and the impact of Brexit policy, do you think is the bigger concern for the Chancellor right now?
I think inflation has to be the immediate concern. Inflation will come down quite a bit. It will halve this year anyway, unless something really dreadful happens. Because of changes worldwide. People are adjusting supply to the problems of losing Russian supply in the Ukraine war. And food shortages should begin to ease globally as the year goes on. So we'll see some fall in inflation, but still to a level that's far too high. Between now and the election, getting inflation down to the Bank of England's 2% target is very important. Although the bank's got the most work to do there, the bank can do more about it than the government can. But what I liked about the speech and what I like about Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor is he does have a sensible, grown-up approach to the public finances. If he just starts borrowing and printing money and giving in to lobbying from right-wing Tory backbenchers or from militant or paying off militant strike action in the public service, he'll feed inflation, which would be disastrous.
But politics always comes into it in the end, Ken Clark. I mean, would the Chancellor be right, do you think, to be pegging tax cuts for the next election, for that manifesto that's going to come up in, around 18 months' time?
No, because I think the vast majority of the public know perfectly well that he can't afford tax cuts. This is a time like this, you can't suddenly start reducing the government's revenues. The majority of the Conservative, I'm not in the parliamentary party anymore, and a lot of them are new since I retired in 2019. But it's only 3 years ago that I retired. The vast majority of Conservative MPs don't believe in tax cuts. It's these new right-wingers we've got, hardline right-wingers, who have this rather simplistic view that somehow tax cuts automatically start the economy growing and that boosts revenues and it somehow pays for itself, which is almost childlike. And we saw how the markets reacted to it when Kwesi Kwarteng and Liz Truss tried it a few months ago. We don't want to go back there. The average Conservative MP knows that economic competence is what usually gets a Conservative government elected, and cutting taxes would not be competent economically.
Well, as you pointed out there, it was Liz Truss who was suggesting that tax cuts would also reduce inflation and help grow the economy. I mean, surely you're not accusing her of being childlike.
I think the views are very simplistic. I just don't think that's true. She seemed to think that like followed as night followed day. I'm not accusing her of being childlike. Of course, I'm not. But I just don't agree. I think neither did the markets, and her attempts to follow that path sort of demonstrably disastrous. I think a lot of MPs think this is just buying votes before an election from the better off middle classes who they rely on in their particular safe constituencies. But most successful, prosperous middle-class people would realise that this was just an attempt to buy their votes, and they're not so foolish as to believe that tax cuts would automatically have the beneficial effects on growth in the economy as is sometimes claimed.
I mean, it sounds like a worrying split there in the Conservative Party, at least in Westminster, something to keep an eye on. But of course, there are other questions too that the
We are a
party is.
minority. I think I'm a mainstream conservative, always have been, and I think mainstream conservative opinion, which has always been rooted in responsible management of the economy,
Yeah.
remains pretty strong.
Well, I was going to say there's another problem that the party is currently facing, which is, of course, the investigation into Nadeem Zahawi. He's not the only one being looked into for different allegations against him. I mean, just taking a step back, thinking about this from your perspective, we seem to have seen a lot of sleaze allegations in the last 3 years. Is this the worst that you've ever seen it?
I'm not sure. I don't normally follow these kind of stories. I think thanks to social media, the tabloid right-wing media have become utterly obsessed with personalities and trying to destroy the reputation of public figures, which, of course, people who misbehave destroy their own reputation. But I really do get fed up with the amount of attention paid to these kind of things compared with the huge problems facing a nation. And the policy issues, which don't get much serious debate in some of the right-wing tabloids. Here we face, an economic crisis, a real crisis in the National Health Service, a war in Europe, in Ukraine, and people keep trying to dig up some scandal about somebody's tax affairs. It has an effect of very much disillusioning the public. And the worst effect of the public is it persuades too many people, they're all rogues and it doesn't make any difference, and it makes people very cynical about politics. So I wish they'd lay off and just report fairly and in more moderate terms if there is some doubt about public standards, because, of course, it's very important we maintain public standards in our government and public life.